This week we're kicking off the very first ever superhero timeline, and what better way to do that than start off with the very first superhero of all. We're talking about Superman. And I'm going to be your host. I'm actually filling in for your regular host who couldn't be here because I'm a totally different guy. You can tell this because I look totally different.
So with the exception of the Kirk Allen film serials or the George Reeves TV show, the first live-action Superman on film was 1978's Superman, directed by Richard Donner. It kicks off by reminding us that in 1938 the first Superman comic was released, and holy crap is that John Williams soundtrack amazing. We start off by meeting Jor-El and the evil Kryptonians, and then, let me see if I do this justice.
Doomed planet. Desperate scientists. Last hope. Kindly couple.
Little Clark here is a few years older now and has some extra abilities, and then we jump ahead to a high school age Clark who has some enhanced strength and super speed, and then when Pa Kent passes, he heads north where we discover that he's 18 years old now, and he gets an extensive training session that we're told takes 12 years, and we quickly see that he's able to fly now, and he heads to Metropolis. We there meet mainstays Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, Superman's pal, and the now nerdified Clark. Every hero needs a villain, so we meet the criminal mastermind, Otis. Well, okay, Otis is the henchman of Lex Luthor, who is also joined by Miss Tess and her mockers. Soon after, Clark goes public, and Superman gives an interview in which he reveals a weakness for not seeing through lead, because he wants to get some action, I guess, and...
Can you read my mind?
Lex mentions that Krypton exploded in 1948 and the ship took 3 years to get to Earth, so the shots with young Clark being discovered would then take place in 1951, and if we assume that baby Kal-El was 1 year old when he took off, teenage Clark would have been in 1965 since he was 18 there, 14 years after he landed, and since we know that 12 years passed between then and current times, it looks like we're actually set in 1977. Lex's real estate plan involves missiles, and he finds Superman's weakness by exposing him to kryptonite, but Miss Tessmacher's betrayal sets him free. He's too late to stop the bomb, and a subsequent earthquake causes the death of Lois Lane, so Superman straight up reverses time. Although I'm not quite sure how this time travel is supposed to work. Some of the damage is reversed, like the dam fixing itself, and Lois is saved. But when he sets time going forward again, the danger isn't reversed. So why don't the events occur in the same way that they occurred in the first place? What happened to the missiles? Lois is actually just sitting on the side of the road with no rock slide endangering her. She talks about the exploding gas station, so it's clear that the earthquake still happened, but did the dam still get destroyed? It doesn't make too much sense, but I've been talking about this one for a while, so we're not going to dwell, as Superman captures Lex and then flies away. So Superman 1 and 2 were filmed back-to-back, although 2 was only about 50 to 60% finished, and they fired Richard Donner and brought Richard Lester in to finish it. Released in 1980, we start off with a recap of the banishment of the evil Kryptonians into the Phantom Zone, which then shifts into a terrorist situation on the Eiffel Tower with a nuke that results in freeing those criminals. We then see Luthor and Otis in jail, and they've been in here for at least a little while, so let's assume that we're in real time for now, and they've been there for like 2 years, and it's now 1979. Luthor and Miss Tessmacher find Superman's Fortress of Solitude, and the blonde bombshell then promptly vanishes from the series, never to be seen again. Lois discovers Clark's identity, and the villains arrive on Earth, causing a ruckus. Too bad that Superman has given up his powers in order to be with Lois, and they bang.
And then he was so proud of Superman for having sex.
Luckily, he's able to get his powers back in time to face off against the trio in Metropolis. A huge battle ensues, and
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. I just had to have this for some reason.
Minor note, there's a bus advertising Evita on Broadway, which debuted in 1979, so that confirms our timeline works. The battle heads up to the fortress, where Superman gets some new powers like this S-shield, teleportation, and hologram duplicates. A lot of people get mad about this whole thing, but I mean, come on, the guy has super breath. How is this any sillier? Although he never ever uses these powers again. Anyway, he tricks the villains into getting their powers taken and then kills Zod, I guess, and one dies on accident, but then Lois straight up murders this one. Superman then uses his most famous power, the Amnesia Kiss, to erase Lois's memory of his identity. You know, the amnesia kiss, which Superman has used lots of times over the years. You don't remember.
Because Superman kissed you.
3 years later, in 1983, Superman 3 is released, and if you wondered how much influence that Richard Donner had on why Superman 2 was so good, you just have to look at this one. Directed by Richard Lester again, it introduces Richard Pryor, who is working on these obviously 1980s-era computers, and Clark goes back to Smallville, which, for what he says, is his 15-year reunion. And this banner says he's from the class of 1965, which lines up with our timeline from the first one. Since it's his 15-year reunion, that places this film firmly in 1980, 1 year after the events of the last film. Anyway, Clark meets back up with Lana Lang, who must remind him of his mother, or something, while Pryor teams up with the villain, Webster. After Superman foils their plans, they hit him with a synthetic kryptonite substitute, which doesn't hurt him, but it does turn him evil.
Well, less evil and more just kind of a douche.
He generally just messes with people, gets laid for the second film in a row, and then just acts like a jerk while drunk. And then, finally, a darkened costume Superman fights against his own self in a junkyard, and whatever you may think about this movie, this whole sequence is just sheer awesomeness. It really, really makes me miss Christopher Reeve. Just some fantastic acting here. Clark eventually wins, and he heads off to stop the villains and their new massive supercomputer, and then after apologizing for sleeping with the henchwoman, he says this.
And you're next, Webster.
He's gonna sleep with Webster next? What was that, pink kryptonite? It's a real thing, look it up.
Gus saves Superman, and this gave me nightmares when I was younger. And Superman destroys the computer, saving the day, and Lana moves to Metropolis, and then promptly vanishes forever.
Maybe her and Miss Tessmacher are hanging out somewhere.
1 year later, in 1984, a spin-off was released with Supergirl, which kicks off with a group of Kryptonian survivors in a pocket dimension living in a place called Argo City. We meet Kara, who mentions her cousin who went to Earth, and she goes there herself to retrieve a lost power source. The source is discovered by our villain, Faye Dunaway, and this quick radio report tells us that Superman is off-planet, explaining his absence from this movie. When Kara arrives, she magically has a costume for some reason, and she uses Clark Kent as a school reference and calls him her cousin, showing that she somehow also knows his secret identity, which really calls into question just how pocket that this pocket dimension really is. We then meet Lucy Lane, Lois's little sister, who is dating Jimmy Olsen, our only character crossover from the main series, and there's this movie poster for The World According to Garp. Well, that came out in 1982, although the poster looks a little old. The movie was shot in 83, so I guess it's fair to say that that's when the film is set, so 83. Stuff happens, including a trip into the Phantom Zone, and Selina eventually gets consumed by her own power, the end. Superman went away for a few years, and it wasn't until 1987 that we saw Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, which was actually partially written by Christopher Reeve. We start off with setting up the fact that Martha Kent has passed away, and for some reason Lex Luthor is back, because I guess someone had compromising photos of Gene Hackman or something. And we're introduced to Lenny Luthor, Lex's nephew, who busts Lex out of prison. Pausing on this newspaper is hard to make out, but it states that it's 1985, giving us a setting for the movie, and yeah, kid, drop dead. Now, here's where the movie takes a turn. He reveals his identity to Lois again, and takes her flying, at one point intentionally dropping her, and then promptly kisses her again to erase her memory like it's some sort of Kryptonian roofie.
Are we sure that the effects of the fake kryptonite have worn off?
Afterwards, Superman destroys all the planet's nuclear weapons by throwing them into the sun, because that sure seems ecologically safe, and Lex creates a hybrid Superman by using a strand of Superman's hair. They fight, and Superman gets a new power, which I guess is super wall building. And after a few more fight scenes, including this one, in which I guess normal human beings can survive being flown into this freaking far into space, Superman defeats Nuclear Man by trapping him in a reactor. Superman saves the day, but not his dignity, and sends Luthor back to prison, where he tells him to see him again in 20 years. That proved to be pretty prophetic, since it was about 20 years until the big screen saw Superman return in 2006, Superman Returns. The opening tells us that Superman left Earth to find the remains of Krypton some time ago, and then we kick off with John Williams' amazing theme, so we're off to a great start. Immediately, we're introduced to Lex Luthor, now played by Kevin Spacey, and then we see Martha Kent on the farm, so it's very clear that, at the very least, Superman 4 did not happen. Supes returns to Earth, Lex goes back to the fortress and makes it clear that he's been there before, indicating that the events of Superman 2 probably happened, and we see Marlon Brando as Jor-El again. Martha mentions that it's been 5 years since Clark left into space, and then we meet new Jimmy, new Perry White, new Lois Lane, and this newspaper shows a date of 2005, so we're set sometime after that. After he makes his first public appearance, we find out that Lois has an asthmatic son, and then this newspaper firmly sets us in 2006. So that rules some things out, since we know conclusively that the first one was 1977, so that would make this one almost 30 years later, and since we know that Clark would have been 30 in that one, he'd have to be 60 years old here and doesn't really look it, and it doesn't really look like anyone else aged either, so we're acknowledging that this is an alternate timeline in which the events of the first 2 Superman films took place around the year 2000, and shortly afterwards he went into space for 5 years. Things happened, and Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor can't be a bad choice, right?
Wrong!
Lex activates his master plan, and oh snap, Lois's kid is actually the son of Superman. And the first thing he does is kill a person.
Whoops.
It's possible that in this reality, a version of the events of Part 2 took place, and when Clark and Lois have sex, this was the outcome, although Supes went off to space too quickly to know about his child. Again, if you have issues with the timeline of the age of the child and such, just know that this is not a direct sequel to Superman 2, and the events most likely happen in a slightly different fashion in this one. Anyway, he saves the day even though there's a ton of kryptonite around, and then he dies for our sins. Seriously, it's not subtle in the tiniest bit. But it doesn't stick, and he says goodbye to his son and just kind of flies off. Reaction to Superman Returns was not so great, and it wasn't until 2013 that we saw a new reboot of the series with Man of Steel kicking off a new DC universe of films. It starts on Krypton, where we meet action hero Jor-El, played by Russell Crowe, and Zod. Jor-El rides a dragon because that's what I think of when I think Superman. The origin happens, and you know the origin by now. And Zod and crew get imprisoned in phantom dildos. Seriously, did H.R. Giger design these? Kal-El makes it to Earth, and we see grown-up Clark working on an oil rig, and then flash back to young Clark growing up, including a bit where Pa Kent suggested he should have let a bus full of kids die in order to keep his secret identity.
Hashtag not my Jonathan Kent.
We meet our new Lois Lane, and a computer screen shows us a year of 2013, so we're set in a year of release here, although a quick flash of a camera readout shows a different date, but at least it's still 2013. We meet our new Perry White, and he's black now, so I'm sure the internet was really mature about that. And we find out that Pa Kent died in 1997 thanks to this handy tombstone. Zod reappears, stating that the destruction of Krypton freed them 33 years ago, so Superman reached Earth in 1980, and then the standard modern superhero city destruction happens, and Supes and Zod have a final face-off, destroying most of the city around them, and it's all fun and games until someone gets a snap neck. Finally, Clark joins the human world by starting a job at the Daily Planet, which I'm sure was easy to get since we've seen his resume includes farmhand, oil rig worker, and drifter. 3 years later, the new DC Universe expanded with Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. It starts off with a mandatory retelling of Batman's origin for the 3 people who haven't seen it before. We're then shown the ending of Man of Steel from Bruce Wayne's perspective, and then we then cut to 18 months later, and if we're going with the November 2013 date from the last one, that would place us in 2015 here, 1 year earlier than its release. We meet Batfleck's Alfred, and in this case file here confirms 2015 as our year, and then we meet Jesse Eisenberg as the Riddler. Or maybe the Joker. Some kind of Joker-Riddler hybrid.
I don't know, but he sure as heck is not playing Lex Luthor.
We see Martha Wayne's grave, and she died in 1981, 1 year after Clark arrived on Earth. This invitation shows the date is November 1st, so we're moved further into the year here. We meet Wonder Woman, and then get a quick commercial for a Flash movie, and then a rather complex series of events, including a jar of pee, sets Bats and Supes against each other. Wendy watches a series of YouTube videos proving that I guess DC is putting the trailers for upcoming films right in the movies instead of before them. Finally, the 2 Titans battle it out, and it looks like Batman is going to win until...
You know what? No. I'm not going to comment on it. You know what happens. You know how dumb it is. Lots of other people have already said how dumb it is. You don't need me to tell you once more how dumb it is.
So, Lex unleashes Doomsday, which is as disappointing as you'd expect. And Wonder Woman saves the day since she's also currently saving the whole DCU. Superman finally kills Doomsday by using a kryptonite spear, even though it also affects him, and even though there's also another super strong and invulnerable person without a vulnerability to kryptonite who's standing like literally right there, but Superman's, I guess, sexist and has to do it himself, even though it kills him, and he's totally dead. We end with a setup for more movies, and then another setup for more movies, and we're left to realize just how unfun these movies are compared to the originals.
So there you have it, 8 movies that kind of go back and forth with continuity, but thank heavens for the fact that Clark Kent works for a newspaper, because the newspapers all had dates on them, which always makes my job a lot easier. I hope you really enjoyed this week's edition of Superhero Timelines. There's going to be lots more in the future, including some of your favorite superheroes that you're bound to want to see. But you can also let me know which ones you would like to see. Maybe there's some off-the-cuff ones that I'm not aware of, or maybe there's ones that people are excited about that, I didn't think the people were excited about. You never know. Let me know. Also, let me know what you think of this video, and like and subscribe to it, and I will let your regular host know when he comes back. And I realize that I'm not wearing anything under this, but I'm kind of committed to it anyway, so I guess I'll just keep doing it. But anyhow, regardless, follow me on Instagram, like me on Facebook, do all that stuff, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks with another great video.